If you just bought your first nail gun or you're in the process of buying your first nail gun, this video is going to be extremely helpful for you. Here I have the Ryobi 18 gauge, 23 gauge, and 16 gauge nailer. I've owned this 18 gauge and the 23 gauge for over 7 years now, and I've had no issues with either of these nailers. This 16 gauge nailer I've added to my shop about 2 years ago, and I also love that nailer as well. In this video, we are going to go over how each one of these work, how they're different, and which one I think you should buy first. And first, we're going to start off with my favorite, the 18 gauge nailer. First, when you go to buy your nails, make sure you get ones that say 18 gauge. And I went with 1 1/4 because that's what I use most of the time. But this nail gun, it can handle anywhere from 5/8 all the way up to 2 inches. And to insert your nails, you'll just pull down on that little lever there, release that, and then you can grab your nails, and you'll see one side has a thicker head right here, and then this side's thinner. And we'll just place that in here, push it all the way up, and then slide it to the top, and your nail gun's all loaded. So once you got your nails loaded, you can go ahead and pop in your battery. And you don't need to be scared of this thing going off on its own. The only way that it's going to fire is if this compresses against the wood. I can sit here and squeeze the trigger and nothing's going to happen. This other trigger right here is to illuminate the LEDs. But the LEDs automatically illuminate anyways whenever you push down and get ready to fire a nail. So it's not really that handy of a feature. But to shoot your nail, just press it in like that and squeeze the trigger and you're good to go. Make sure to not just tap the trigger, because if you do that, that's what's going to happen. You have to actually hold the trigger all the way through. Now you can fire the nail in one of 2 ways. In that first setting, which is a single nail displayed right there, you have to press it down and squeeze the trigger. But if I set it in this other mode, where you switch that, there's 3 nails there. Then with that setting, you can just squeeze this trigger and it'll fire, as long as I'm holding this down, it'll fire each time I bounce it off the wood. So I'm going to do that. So it's basically like rapid fire mode. It's pretty sweet. This gun also comes with this plastic protective piece, which prevents the nail gun from marring your wood whenever you shoot a nail. And then on the side of the gun, there's also this smaller tip that you can use instead. And to swap that out, you can easily just peel this thing off like that. And then you can remove this from the side of your gun and place it right back where you took off the other one. Last setting you need to know about on this gun is adjusting how deep you can shoot your nails. So there's this little dial back here that adjusts the air assist, and then this also helps to dial in your depth adjustment. I'm just going to leave this right where it's at, and we're going to do a quick test on this wood, and we're going to start with it set at the minimum setting. So to do that, I'm just going to turn this all the way to the left, and then we're going to flip this over and fire a nail. So there's one. I'm going to dial this up to the middle, and we'll shoot another one. Now we're going to switch it all the way to the maximum power, and I'm going to fire another nail. So here you can see how that head is more towards the top of the wood, and then in the middle it's sunk down a little bit, and then on the maximum it's as deep as it can go. Now that you know the bare bones basics of how to put this thing together and fire a nail, I'm going to teach you one important trick whenever you're using any nail gun, whether it's the 18 gauge, 23 gauge, or 16 gauge nailer. So one common joint that you're going to want to make right off the bat is a simple butt joint like this. I just super glued this piece on as a support piece. But whenever you go to do this, I always like to mark a center line of the thickness of the material that I'm nailing into. This is 3/4 of an inch wide, so I marked a line at 3/8 of an inch, just to give me a nice center line to aim for so I can put the nail as close to center as I can. Now that you got that all marked out, let's talk about proper orientation whenever you go to shoot a nail. This is one of the biggest mistakes I see people make. You never want to hold your nail gun so that it's parallel to the piece that you're shooting into. When these nails come out of the gun, when you're looking down, it wants to go left and right once it comes out of the nail gun. So if I hold it parallel to the bottom piece, and I'm actually slightly off center to the left, you might just pop out the side there. You see that? Now, if I turned it this way and I'm still off center, it has way less of a chance of it coming out because when it goes down, it's shooting left or right into this piece of wood. It's not shooting down and able to come out to the left or right on the face of the wood. But if you are trying to aim for that perfect center line, this tip on here does include this little mark right here, which is what you need to aim for and line up with your line if you want to be as accurate as possible. So there's one, and that's the one we just fired. Pretty close to the target. So if you guys ever have this nail gun jam up on you, the first thing you're going to want to do is to remove the battery, and then you want to take out any nails that you can. After that, you can go ahead and release this lever up here, and you'll have access right there, and you can use some needle nose pliers or whatever you got to do to unjam the nail. But that honestly has never happened to me, and I've owned this nail gun for 7 years. So I'd say you're going to be just fine. Now at the beginning of this video, I told you guys that this was my favorite and most used nailer, and it is, because a 23 gauge in most cases doesn't give enough power or hold, and then the 16 gauge in a lot of cases gives too much. This is that perfect in between that is pretty much right for any homeowner or woodworker. The thing I use this probably most for is to temporarily secure cabinets together, just using simple butt joints like that, just to hold the cabinet in place so that I can go ahead and add screws and fasteners and all that. But next, let's go ahead and take a look at the smaller, less powerful 23 gauge nailer. Now, when you go to buy the nails for these, you'll want to check and make sure it says 23 gauge. And I also like to use 1 1/4" for these as well, but you have an option of anywhere from a 1/2 inch all the way up to 1 3/8 inches. Now you'll often hear this gun referred to as a pin nailer, and the reason is that the nails are quite a bit smaller than your 18 gauge nailer. They don't even have a head on them. And you can see the head on these is significantly bigger. So to load these into your nail gun, just release it like that. And then since these don't have a head on them, there will be an arrow right there. And you put that facing forward, shove it all the way up, and then you're ready to go. To fire your first nail, you'll obviously need to put the battery in. And the 23 gauge pin nailer is actually more dangerous than the 18 gauge nailer because you can actually fire this thing without pressing the tip into the wood. But to fire it, you're going to need to push down that lever right here. And then if I squeeze the trigger, I just shot a nail across the shop. So don't pull this trigger down until you are ready to actually shoot. The number one thing that you're going to want a pin nailer for is when you're nailing delicate pieces of wood. Maybe it's got some profiling on it, you don't want to damage the profile, or maybe it's a thin strip of wood like this, which you would typically use for some edge banding. So I would obviously add glue first, but then I would just fire the nail by pulling that trigger and then firing it off. And next, we're going to compare that to the 18 gauge, and you can clearly see why you wouldn't want an 18 gauge nailer. you can clearly see that the 18 gauge right here tends to damage your wood way more than your pin nailer. The 18 gauge does have more strength and like holding power, but the pin nailer leaves a much smaller hole, and for things like this, you don't need that much holding power. So in this case, the 18 gauge is overkill. Next, let's take a look at the largest nail gun that I own from Ryobi, and that's the 16 gauge nailer. When you go to buy your nails, make sure to grab the box that says 16 gauge, and I have some 2-inch ones here. But this nail gun can handle anywhere from 3/4 of an inch all the way up to 2.5 inches. And to load the nails in, you can just pull this slide down and it'll lock right there. And then you want to flip your gun up, and you can load up to 2 strips of these. Just make sure the head is facing this way, and you can slide it in just like that. And once they're installed, you just have to release this lever by pulling down, pressing that button, and then it slides up. This gun also comes with a protective non-marring tip, just like on the 18 gauge, and then it comes with an identical replacement one down here if you need it. Now if you get a nail jam on this one, you first want to lock your slide, release all the nails you can, and then you can unjam your gun by releasing this up here, folding that back, and then you have access to unjam it with some needle nose pliers or whatever you need. And to lock that back up, just hook it on there, and you're good to go. Now when you go to fire a nail, it's very similar to the 18 gauge. You just want to hold it down, and you can shoot. But how it's different than the 18 gauge is this one had that rapid fire mode, remember? So we could fire multiple nails at a time. With this, you don't have that setting, so you can't just hold the trigger down and fire away. You can only fire a single nail at a time. Now real quick, let's go ahead and test out the minimum, middle, and maximum settings. So we're going to set that all the way as low as it can go. Come over here. And then I'm going to dial it up to the middle. Fire one off. And then we'll set it to the maximum setting. And here's a look at our results. Same thing as the 18 gauge. On the minimum setting, the head is close to the top of the wood, and then it's a little further down and further down on the maximum setting. And you can also tell by looking at the underside of the wood which one shot deeper. Next, let's go ahead and compare all 3 of these nailers and how they work on this 3/4 inch thick piece of pine. So first, I'm going to go with the 16 gauge right here. And then we'll go with the 18 gauge. And finally, we'll do the 23 gauge. So you can clearly see here the difference in these 3 nail guns. You got your smallest hole all the way up to your biggest one. So it's really important to choose the right nail gun for whatever job you're working on. And here's just a quick shot at the underside of what that looks like. The 16 gauge creates the most blowout, and then the 18 gauge leaves some blowout as well. And then this little area around this 23 gauge nail was just a defect in the wood. This was not caused by the actual nail. Now the reason I bought this 16 gauge nailer 2 years ago was strictly for home remodeling purposes. And the 2 things I use it most for is installing baseboards and then trim around doors and windows. This 16 gauge gun has a lot more holding power than this 18 gauge gun. You could get away with this, but this is going to ensure that your baseboards never come out of place or your door and window trim. Now for a quick example, I'm going to nail up this little scrap piece of trim on this door frame so that you can see how I would use these 2 guns in a real life scenario. So first I would mark my 1/4 inch reveal like that. And then I would hold my piece up against my line. And I would only use my 18 gauge gun for nailing this thing into the frame. So I would place it right here and then pop it into the frame of the door like that. And now this 16 gauge gun, which has a lot more holding power, it's going to shoot through this piece of wood, through the drywall, and then into the stud behind it to lock everything in place. And that's how I would use these two guns together. So here's an up close look of that 18 gauge nail that was shot into our door frame. And then here's the 16 gauge nail that went through the drywall and into the stud. So which one of these nail guns are right for you? Well, the obvious choice, whether you're a woodworker or a home remodeler, the first nail gun that you need to buy is this 18 gauge nail gun. That's the easy question to answer. The harder question to answer is the second one. Which one should you buy second? So if you're a woodworker, hobbyist woodworker, whatever, I think that you're going to be best suited with going with the 23 gauge nailer. Now, if you don't do much woodworking and you do a lot of construction, home remodeling, the second gun I think you must buy is this 16 gauge nailer. And I know Ryobi gets looked at as like a beginner entry line product, but like I said, I've had these two nail guns for 7 years now, and they've never let me down. So if you are thinking about buying these nail guns, I think you're gonna get a really good deal on these because they're available at such a cheap price. I wouldn't spend the extra money and go with a Milwaukee, especially if you're not using this thing every day for 12 hours a day, which most people aren't if you're watching this video. If you're just a hobbyist or you're trying to remodel your home, Ryobi is definitely the way to go when it comes to nail guns. I hope this video gave you some good insight on these 3 nail guns and is going to help you make a decision on which one you should buy. If you guys did get any value or learned anything out of this video, the biggest way that you can help me is by simply clicking that like button right below this video. I thank you guys for tuning into this one, and I will see you on the next one.